This episode of New Politics was released on the 30th of July, 2022, and produced on the land of the Wongal and Whadjuk people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, the audacious start to the new term of Parliament and the on-water matters released on election day. Was it a breach of caretaker conventions and was it corruption? I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, in charge of Liberal text messages since 2007.
And a big thank you to our new Patreon subscribers. Thanks for signing up. And if you'd like to support New Politics, you can support us through a Patreon subscription. It's just $5 per month for the Ruby Standard supporter level or $10 per month for the Gold Standard supporter level. Whether it's a subscription or if you just want to listen in, read our material online or buy a t-shirt or buy a book, it's all available at newpolitics.com.au, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. Federal Parliament has returned and it's also the first session of the 47th term of government since 1901. The members of Parliament and senators have been sworn in, and as is the tradition, the Governor-General read out the statement of the government's ambitions over the next parliamentary term, and it's quite an ambitious list. There's the commitment to raise wages, there's reforms to the energy market, there's commitments to aged care residents, providing assistance to people affected in the recent floods, cost of living, there's reductions of greenhouse emissions by 43%, the voice to Parliament, there's a commitment to act on deaths in custody, an upgraded national broadband network, there's better training for the workforce, there's universal childcare, establishing paid family and domestic violence leave, emergency housing, implementing the Human Rights Commission's report on safe workplaces for women, gender equity. And this isn't even half of what the Governor-General read out. There's a great deal of work that the government wants to attend to over the next 3 years. David, you and I have complained about governments not doing enough in the past, especially over the past 9 years of coalition government. But now that we've got a government that actually wants to achieve a great deal, is the new Labor government trying to achieve too much and possibly setting itself up to fail? Or should all governments have these high ambitions?
You could, in some sense, compare it to the Whitlam government of 72, which also had a very broad and wide-sweeping reform agenda. I think some of it is not going to happen this term just because of the pure amount of logistics, the pure amount of the ability of the government to get things done. That's not an anti-government swipe. Everything has limitations. And really, I mean the parliament to get things done and the public service and just the logistics of this stuff. It's more than just throwing money at it. The money has to be spent effectively. It has to be targeted. It has to be given to the right people. Having said that, I think it's better for a government to promise too much and get most of it done than to promise too much and get none of it done and not even try, like the last government, or not promise enough and then languish for 12 months before the next election trying to work out what to do next. It paints a picture of what Labor wants Australia to be. And I think that's a good thing. I think too, and I keep warning against this, that popular things become unpopular. Governments that are well-loved become hated. Governments that can't deliver on things, no matter what the reason, will disappoint. And they'll disappoint someone. Now, the nice thing is that it's a relatively sympathetic Senate. We've discussed this before. I don't think the Greens want to see themselves as being pushovers, but I also don't think a lot of the stuff that Labor is proposing is something that is deeply offensive to the soul of the Greens. Some of it may be, but given that the government has an absolute majority in the lower house and a workable minority in the upper house, a lot of this stuff will be possible. Whether it's all possible in 3 years is the other thing. Some of it, I suspect you're going to have to watch, again, the pure logistics. And everything comes at not just a monetary cost, but a physical, social, cultural.
Well, I guess there's also the political costs as well, but I think that all governments should be ambitious in what they set out to achieve. So I think we've got agreement on that, but it also depends on what they want to achieve. It could be argued that the previous coalition government had a very ambitious agenda as well, but it didn't seem to be in the interests of the community. They implemented the robo-debt scheme. They cut back Medicare. They cut funding to the aged care sector. They hampered unions. They implemented a very slow national broadband network. They had targeted funding for sports programs in marginal seats during the sports rorts affair. So it's not like they did nothing.
The Indue card?
The Indue card, there's a whole lot of other programs that just didn't seem to be in the community interest. So it's not like they did nothing, but what they did achieve was not very good and seemed to work against the interests of the general community. And it has been interesting to compare the flavour of ambitions from this new government with the opening agenda of the Morrison government back in 2019 when the 46th Parliament was opened, and that primarily focused on the individual, the quiet Australians, everyone getting ahead, tax cuts, small business, attacking unions, diminishing workplace rights, whereas the focus of the Labor government is based around inclusivity and community well-being, and I guess this is what we would normally expect from a Labor government.
You'd hope so. You hope that they're pro-union. You hope that they're on the side of the less advantaged in society, while still supporting more advantaged in terms of entrepreneurship and allowing small business particularly to run efficiently. And there's a lot of balls in the air that Labor needs to keep juggling. Liberal too, but the Liberal Party seem less, in its current form, seems less interested in that.
So the Governor-General's speech, it's just a statement of what the government wishes to achieve in its term, and it's just a blueprint. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's all going to happen, and not much of the Morrison government's agenda was actually achieved, although that was hampered by a pandemic for 2/3 of their last term in office. But it's always going to be the actions and the work that a government actually does rather than what it talks about doing and never gets around to doing it. And I think we had quite a lot of that under the Morrison government. But one aspect that I have noticed is that the tone of government is quite different. The Prime Minister did implore members of Parliament to not miss this opportunity and have a source of pride in what they do rather than having any regrets.
So I say to everyone here, all of my parliamentary colleagues, don't miss the chance. Because you're not here for that long, none of us will be. And when you're sitting on the porch, thinking about what you did, you can either have a source of pride or a source of regret. No middle path. No middle path. Make it a source of pride.
And the new tone of a parliamentary term does tend to be more reflective, especially when one side of politics has had a bad loss. And that's probably because they've realised that they'll be out of office for at least another 3 years, and the losers tend not to have too much enthusiasm for political fights at this stage of the parliamentary term. But the process of politics does have to change. It needs to be less combative and more productive. Sally Situ is one of the new members of Parliament, and she's a member for Reid, and she has called upon this new Parliament to live up to its reputation as the most representative Parliament in Australia's history.
I grew up watching Home and Away and Neighbours, but I also grew up with a slight unease, not sure of who I was, not sure if I'd gone to the right schools, and acutely aware of the postcode I grew up in, not sure of my place in this country. That's why I think it's important to have someone like me in our federal parliament, not for diversity's sake, but because representatives that embody all of the Australian story make our parliament better and our democracy stronger.
And become audacious dreamers on climate change. Now, this might not be up there with Barack Obama's audacity of hope from the 2008 US election, but I think this is heading in the right direction. The time wasters have to just get out of the way. They have to stop denying that there's a climate change emergency, as if we haven't had enough reminders over the past decade with extreme bushfires and extreme flooding in the eastern seaboard. Another new Member of Parliament, Zoe Daniel, in the seat of Goldstein, she's also called for more action on climate change, as have several other independent MPs. And that was a strong message from the electorate: act on climate change. And I think that if this doesn't happen, or if there is obstruction, there will be electoral consequences for those members of Parliament and political parties that stand in the way.
If Parliament has a mandate, it's to fix climate change. There's other things that the Labor Party have promised to do that its supporters wanted it to do, but I think across nearly all voting demographics, and there are notable exceptions, but certainly the majority, Parliament has to try and stop human-caused climate change. Whether we can or not remains to be seen, but certainly I think that's the one thing that the Parliament has to address. And if that's done with 55 members walking out of the chamber in protest, then good luck to it. I've noticed that both Labor and Greens have backed down a little bit from their very hardline stances of we want 43% reduction and the Greens saying that's unacceptable. It's now Labor have said, well, 43 is just the first step. We will put more in. We just have to get to that first very quickly. And the Greens have said, yep, okay, that seems to be fair enough. We will be pushing for more, but we're going to try and work for you. This is a good thing. It's certainly a priority, not from a political point of view, from a human life point of view.
And I think there's also an expectation from the electorate that Parliament should be a place for problem solving and constructive solutions for the community. And this might be a tall order because the nature of Australian politics and most politics all around the world has been like a combative sport. So politics to us might be seeming okay at the moment before it gets back to its frustratingly bad habits, but let's see how that goes. Now, already the coalition in opposition seems to be ignoring this message of politics being like a resolution centre, and they're still fighting the last election as far as I can see. They've said that they won't support any climate change legislation, insisting that they're the ones that have got a mandate for their existing policies, and that's on the basis of the coalition receiving 35% of the primary vote at the last election, whereas Labor received 33%. Now, instead of wasting everyone's time, I think they should go to the Australian Electoral Commission and try to argue their case and see how far they get. But just another example of this, aged care reform is the first bill to pass this new session of Parliament, or this new term of Parliament, and this is applying all the recommendations from the Royal Commission into aged care quality and safety, and that's a report that the previous government sat on for almost a year and then did almost nothing about it when they did receive it. The Shadow Health Minister, Anne Ruston, she has accused the Albanese government of playing politics by introducing this bill. Well, if playing politics is introducing all the things that a government said that it would do, as well as implementing all the recommendations of a Royal Commission into an important social service, well, I just say bring it on. This is what governments are meant to do. And it seems that while the public wants something different from politics, the coalition just doesn't want to move on. The Council on the Ageing has welcomed the introduction of this bill, as has the Aged Care Community Care Providers Association, the United Workers Union, and the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation. So this is a measure and a bill that everyone welcomes, but the coalition makes the claim of a government playing politics. The government has also introduced legislation for paid family and domestic violence leave. They've also released the Closing the Gap report on Indigenous disadvantage. Not that there's any good news in that. They've provided an economic update. So they're just getting on with the business of government. And all the coalition is doing is offering opposition for opposition's sake. Now, it's just got to do much better than this.
They still see that the Tony Abbott period of opposition was extremely successful. And in one sense it was, but in another sense it hampered, it didn't actually achieve anything. And then when they got into office, they didn't know what to do with it. And Tony Abbott is removed relatively quickly. Instead of the 2 or 3 terms he could have expected, he lasted less than 1. And it didn't get better. Malcolm Turnbull scrapes through, Scott Morrison scrapes through. And then, of course, they go to one of the biggest losses in terms of seats that the Liberal Party has ever had. And it seems that they haven't learned their lesson. Now, they still have a lot of the same people. Peter Dutton, currently Leader of the Opposition, was a senior minister for most of his tenure. Suzanne Ley was a senior minister. Michaelia Cash was a senior minister. Simon Birmingham was a senior minister. So it's the same people. And, of course, you'd expect that too. But there seems to be no sense of why did they lose the election, except they all want to blame Scott Morrison. I suspect the next pre-selection rounds for the coalition will become very interesting, as underperforming members will be put under a lot of pressure by their local branches, I think. And with Morrison all but gone, I'm not sure that you'll get people parachuted into local seats as easily as they could.
You're listening to New Politics. You can subscribe to us on Apple or Google Podcasts, listen through YouTube, SoundCloud and Amazon Music, or find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can now support New Politics through Patreon.
Now, generally on New Politics, we don't talk about Pauline Hanson, we don't like time wasters, and we don't like wasting the time of our audience, but I think once or twice every 2 or 3 years is okay. But she walked out on the acknowledgement of country in the Senate, shouting out that she would never acknowledge Indigenous lands in Australia. Well, it's a little bit too late for that, Pauline. The Mabo case from 1992 overturned terra nullius, and native title has legally acknowledged Indigenous lands since 1994. There was also a motion passed by the Senate to include the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags in the Senate. I don't think this is a big deal. It should have been done a long, long time ago. And we do have to remember that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags, they are actually official national flags. But Pauline Hanson was sitting in the back of the Senate chamber while all of this was going on, like a scolded little child. Now, the reason why we rarely discuss Pauline Hanson on New Politics is that we don't think that she's politically significant, despite all the media focus and attention that she used to receive through 7 West Media and 9 Media. And despite her name recognition, she only received 0.88% of the primary vote in the Queensland Senate. So that's less than 1%, and just scraped through on a Senate quota through the ticket distribution. Originally, she only became a senator because Malcolm Turnbull stupidly called a double dissolution election in 2016 and changed the Senate election rules, which resulted in fringe dwellers like Pauline Hanson being elected to the Senate. Acknowledgement to country or a recognition of Indigenous lands, this is very important, as is hoisting Indigenous flags in the Senate. But Pauline Hanson is in the Senate and she'll be there for the next 6 years. Having her there is like having some kind of relic in Parliament and as a reminder of Australia's racist past. She's really got no other purpose in public life.
The flags should be in the Senate. The Senate should represent every Australian citizen, as should the House of Representatives. And that doesn't mean we run every national flag in there because people come from all over the world. Once you're an Australian citizen, those flags mean something else. They still might be important to you, but you are no longer represented by them if you're an Australian citizen. And even as a dual citizen, once you're in the chamber, it is Australian interests first. And that includes the very important acknowledgement of country. One of the arguments is that it doesn't mean anything, it's just symbolic, and why do we do it? To a lot of these people, you could say the same thing about church. It's an important thing for a lot of individuals, and it's an important inclusive thing. And Australia has had, let's be frank, a very appalling record on Indigenous affairs. This is a small step in the right direction. And if Pauline is really worried about racism, she would acknowledge this. And even if she doesn't like it, see it as a way of including all Australians. And of course, when she talks about racism, she's talking about racism against rich white people, the racism that none of us talk about because, well, it doesn't exist. And it's just privilege pushing back against what it sees as an encroachment on its own position.
Oh, so there we go. We've fulfilled the quota on Pauline Hanson. I think we'll book her in again for 2024 or 2025. So the new term of Parliament has commenced. There's another 3 years to go, and it all gets down to how well the new government plays its brand of politics, how well it manages expectations, and how well it manages the media as well. Already, we've had the opposition pushing the idea that Labor hasn't fixed up the economy, even though it's only been in office for 9 weeks. They haven't done anything about foot and mouth disease that might be coming through from Indonesia. They've been accused of not doing anything on interest rates or rising inflation. Now, all of these issues do have to be balanced carefully, and if they're not, Labor will have quite a few problems. But it seems like they're getting some help from the opposition, where one Liberal Party MP, Bridget Archer, she's the member for Bass in Tasmania, she said that she's prepared to cross the floor to support Labor's legislation on climate change. And she said that she might also support other legislation as well. Now, this won't get her many friends within the current Liberal Party, but it seems that there are a few Liberal Party MPs who are realising the political reality on climate change at least, and it has been a divisive issue for the Liberal Party internally for some time, and while they did receive a lot of political benefit for railing against climate change and carbon pricing back in 2013, this might end up being the issue that drowns them out in the future. Now, you can never say never in politics, but I cannot see Peter Dutton ever leading the Liberal Party to an election victory. And I suspect that the Liberal Party will follow on from the experiences of the Conservative Party in the UK, where they just had a flurry of different leaders after they lost the election in 1997, and each of them were just a different male version of Margaret Thatcher, and finally getting to a more moderate and electorally more palatable leader in David Cameron 13 years later. And I think that the Liberal Party just has to make that clean break from the Howard years, and it can't really succeed in its current form. It's like a nihilistic combative force that doesn't know what to do with itself. It's keen to continue with that obstructive narrowness that was a feature of the Howard, Abbott and Morrison governments, and it seems to be playing its brand of politics as a replica of the Republican Party in the United States, and it just cannot keep doing this.
It needs a severe reform, maybe even a closing down and a rebuild. It's still really on a 20th century model that has failed. And these things do take time. The last really major reform, we can look at Menzies' formation of the party, where you had the young, charismatic, brash, ambitious, capable, intelligent Robert Menzies as a figurehead. In the 1980s, which was, I guess, the last time it reformed, although it never officially did, you had the capable John Howard as one figurehead and the capable Andrew Peacock on the other side. There aren't any figureheads. Tony Abbott is seen as a figurehead by his supporters, although he's not coming back. Malcolm Turnbull's not coming back. And of course, these men are a bit old. Not being ageist here, but it's going to be a 10-year building. They could be part of the process, but I don't think they'd be the figurehead that people would want to circle round. Nobody wants Scott Morrison anywhere near politics, apparently not even Scott Morrison. And as far as I can tell, there's no one in the party who could sort of raise up and reform the party to a new, more electorally acceptable and more contemporary party. Now, it's not to say that the press won't be pushing their very hardest to make Peter Dutton or candidate B or candidate C Prime Minister when the time comes. But the press has lost its relevance too. The mainstream press, and you can tell that in the more and more strident columns, which are all saying the same thing. Look at me, I'm still relevant. Look, I've got something to say. Please listen to us. Please, please, please. And the voices are getting fainter and fainter. Now, again, all of this can change. And of course, I could be wrong on this. I could be just seeing it through too narrow a lens. But I don't think I am. And I think the Liberal Party will be in opposition a very, very long time unless they start the hard process of reform. And that will mean getting rid of people, which is always hard and sad and, if necessary, and the only right thing to do, doesn't make it any easier. That will mean rethinking what they think about things. The Teals showed them the way forward, I think. Maybe. It's a really interesting thing.
You're listening to New Politics. You can subscribe to us on Apple or Google Podcasts, listen through YouTube, SoundCloud and Amazon Music, or find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can now support New Politics through Patreon.
Alors voilà Clyde a une petite amie. Elle est belle et son prénom c'est Ronnie Parker. À eux deux ils forment le gang Power. Leur nom est Clyde Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie and
The new parliament has commenced, but there's still a few issues left over from the old parliament, and that's the one act that took place on election day. Scott Morrison decided to announce that there was an interception of an asylum seeker boat.
There has been an interception of a vessel en route to Australia. I've been here to stop this boat in order for me to be there to stop those that may come from here. You need to vote Liberal and Nationals today.
And that was publicised by the Liberal Party on election day, and the targeted text messages were sent to undecided voters all across Australia. There's a few issues to take into account here. The first one is breaking the caretaker convention. Morrison claimed that the Labor opposition had been briefed about this interception. Now, we haven't seen any evidence of this. The Office of Home Affairs was politicised, and Morrison also wanted the details to be dropped directly to his list of preferred journalists, and that's mainly from Murdoch's News Corporation, and it was an act of total political desperation. So obviously the tactic didn't work, but it showed the sort of lengths Morrison and the Liberal Party was prepared to go to try and win an election.
It was too late then anyway. I think most people had made up their mind. I got 3 or 4 phone calls and messages from friends of mine saying, is this a last-ditch effort from the government, or is this a scam? Did I get one of these? And of course, I'm in a very safe Labor seat. I didn't get one. I didn't feel slighted or upset. I guess this type of technique had worked in the last election. But again, like a lot of scam artists, they don't change their strategy. But once you've been caught out, you won't con the people again. It may have moved a couple of votes, but if anything, it hardened people's resolve not to vote for them. And if it did win a seat, and I doubt it did, they needed to win 20 seats, and it didn't happen.
Oh, well, I do realise that political parties will try to use any tactic to win an election, but this was a real sign of desperation. The headquarters at the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, they usually know on the Thursday night before the election day if they are going to win or lose the election, and they probably weren't as sure for this election because of the lower primary votes for the major parties, the impact of the pandemic and pre-poll voting, but everything else totally pointed towards a Labor victory. And to trash the conventions of election protocols by confecting an outrage at 12:50pm on election day when the voting was almost over, it just shows how absolutely desperate and deluded the leadership of the Liberal Party actually was. And here's what the Prime Minister had to say about it.
If we needed a final reminder of the legacy that we inherit, it's come out on the weekend with the report into what occurred on May the 21st, trying to scare people into a vote on polling day and trying to trash the separation that's there between government and the independent public service during a caretaker convention period. This is unprecedented for a government to act like that on polling day. For what we know now is that the then Prime Minister gave a statement before any public statement had been given by the department. This is a guy who used to say that he wouldn't give answers to anything about these issues, that they were on water matters. And here we had an unprincipled action by a government that was desperate and was prepared to do anything whatsoever to try to retain power, and it was an appalling act, and it should be they should be held to account for that appalling act on the final day.
So it was the final act of the coalition government, and it was symbolic of its performances and behaviour over the past 9 years. For all of that time they were in office, they never discussed on-water matters, but 5 hours before the polls started to close on election day, they were quite happy to talk about on-water matters as much as possible and hope that it would somehow result in a last-minute election victory. And as you alluded to before, David, there is some research to suggest that it did actually put people off and it did influence some votes, but not very many. But the whole incident backfired and it showed the true nature of Scott Morrison as a leader and the true nature of the current Liberal Party as well.
Their strategy was always, when in doubt, kick into the helpless. Get that politics of envy going. The thing is, the politics of envy only takes you so far. After a while, people start to see that maybe homeless people don't get the opportunity to not work over you working your hours. Maybe that the mentally ill have more issues than just being different. Maybe Indigenous people don't get enough help. And you're always going to get that politics of envy. But it ebbs and flows, and good leadership puts it down and smooths it out and explains why you shouldn't be envious of people beneath you. And in fact, you shouldn't be envious of people above you either. You should just do your very best and see what happens. It was just a sad, pathetic case of desperation by a man who had sold himself on being a great campaigner. And results speak better than words in this case.
And we've had our issues before with Michael Pizzullo. He's the Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs, but he refused to follow government orders on the day, and that's because he was obliged not to under the Public Service Act and also under caretaker conventions during the election period, and also because he would have lost his job and possibly even had criminal charges laid against him. And he was also smart enough to realise that the coalition was going to lose the election, so why compromise his career? But the actions of Scott Morrison, and we did promise to the New Politics audience that we wouldn't focus so much on Scott Morrison because he's yesterday's man, but there is still so much material to work with here, and his actions could be the focus of the future Federal Anti-Corruption Commission as well. Scott Morrison wasn't actually in Canberra for the launch of Parliament this week. His reason was that he had already accepted an invitation to appear at the 6th Global Opinion Leaders Summit in Tokyo, and that includes other Conservative former leaders such as David Cameron from the UK, Stephen Harper from Canada, Yulia Tymoshenko from the Ukraine, John Key from New Zealand. So these people are all political has-beens and they've been out of office for some time. Former Prime Ministers, whatever we might think of them, they should travel to these types of conferences, but you really have to choose your moments. And we have to remember that Scott Morrison is still a Member of Parliament. He hasn't actually retired from politics yet, so missing the first day of National Parliament, it really shows where his priorities are. And many people have criticised Morrison for not being in Parliament and going overseas instead, and I guess it depends on, well, what would we be expecting him to do if he actually did attend Parliament? Possibly join Pauline Hanson in the back of the Senate to sulk about the Indigenous flags in the chamber. But I'm actually going to retract what I said last week when I said that Scott Morrison should remain in politics to remind us of what a bad leader looks like and the type of leadership that we need to avoid in the future. But if this is what he's going to get up to, well, he doesn't actually need to be in Parliament. It's probably best for him to leave and let the people in the seat of Cook have a Member of Parliament who can represent them effectively.
You're right. Prime Ministers, ex-Prime Ministers still have some kind of standing. This seemed to be some kind of losers group who he was talking to, in that people who'd lost office. He seems to have really picked a wrong moment to go, as you said. And it shows just how much he cares about Australian politics, which is not much. These types of things happen all the time. If he couldn't do this one, he'd do the next one. And apparently he's charging $50,000 to speak. How do you get onto that circuit? Because I do public lectures from time to time, and I don't get that much. If someone is willing to pay me that much, I will come and I will speak for as long as you like.
Well, we should both join this international circuit and see how that goes as well.
Yeah. Tony Abbott did the same thing, although he very quickly took that job with the British Trade Office, which again was a very bizarre job for an ex-Australian Prime Minister to take. So I guess you get your one or two jobs and then people realise that there are better people for that kind of money, or pay less for better people. Prime Ministers have stayed on the backbench for years after and done their work as backbenchers diligently and well. I don't think the words diligently and well have ever been applied to Scott Morrison, so he probably should go. We wear the expense of a by-election, and whoever wins should represent the people of Cook, as every member should represent their seat as best as they can.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. If you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.